General Hospital will reveal Brooke Lynn had spent countless nights haunted by the ghost of a decision she made long ago, a decision that, despite being buried under layers of time, never stopped whispering in the shadows of her heart. She had never allowed herself to imagine what the day would look like when she would finally come face to face with the child she had once given up. In her quietest moments, she sometimes envisioned a tearful reunion, one steeped in forgiveness and maternal redemption, a moment where her outstretched arms would finally embrace the child she had longed for, where unspoken regrets would dissolve into healing silence. But nothing had prepared her for the brutal chaos of reality. When the truth about Joe's identity finally surfaced, it didn't arrive on the wings of peace. It came like a tempest, tearing through the fragile walls she had built to protect her aching soul. This was not a moment of reunion, it was a reckoning. The truth did not glide gently into Joe's life either. It struck with the cruel force of betrayal. For as long as he could remember, Camila had been his mother, his source of comfort, his protector, his home. Every memory he held dear was painted with the softness of her voice, the warmth of her arms, the unwavering love in her eyes. He had never once questioned the authenticity of that love or the legitimacy of their bond. And then, everything shattered. The woman who had raised him, the woman whose grave he still visited when life felt too heavy to bear, was not the woman who gave him life. The revelation came not from whispers or gossip, but from Camila herself, in a recording she had left behind, one final, trembling confession made before death took her voice forever. In that recording, Camila's voice was cracked with sorrow, filled with regret but overflowing with love. She spoke of the day she took Gio into her arms, how she promised herself she would never let him feel unwanted, how she vowed to become everything he needed and more. But within those confessions was the truth Gio never wanted to hear. He was not the child of fate or accident, but the child of a young woman, Brooke Lynn, who had been too overwhelmed by fear, shame, and circumstances to keep him. Camila begged for his forgiveness, pleaded for him to understand, but her words, however tender, became daggers to Joe's heart. To Gio, the world he had known, safe, simple, whole, collapsed in an instant. He was no longer the son of the woman he adored. He was the product of abandonment. His very identity, the core of who he believed himself to be, felt stolen. It was not merely the betrayal of his mother's secret, it was the betrayal of every certainty he had ever held. Who was he if not Camila's son? And how could he reconcile this storm of emotions with a new reality that demanded he embrace a stranger, Brooke Lynn, as the woman who brought him into the world? For Brooke Lynn, the pain was just as piercing, though laced with a guilt that dug deeper than any wound. She had known that her son might not welcome her with open arms. She had braced for resentment, for disbelief, even for hatred. But nothing could prepare her for the blankness in his eyes when he looked at her, not with curiosity, not with wonder, but with a hollow disbelief that chilled her to the core. He did not see her as the mother he lost. He saw her as the cause of everything that now felt broken. And in that moment, as she stood before him, desperate to speak but silenced by fear, Brooke Lynn saw the chasm between them widen. She had dreamed of finally telling him everything, how young she was, how powerless, how her family's disapproval and her own uncertainty had cornered her into a decision that would haunt her forever. But Gio didn't want to hear apologies. He wanted answers. He wanted space. And most of all, he wanted to hold on to the image of the only mother he had ever known, a woman whose memory was now tangled in secrets and lies. Joe's grief was not simple. It was not just sadness or rage, it was disorientation, like the ground beneath his feet had given way. He lashed out not because he hated Brooke Lynn, but because he didn't know how to love her. Not yet. Not when everything felt so painfully raw. The idea of a biological connection meant little when the emotional bond had never been formed. And even if he wanted to believe in her remorse, in her longing, there was still a part of him screaming that it was too late. Too many birthdays missed. Too many milestones lost. Too much silence. So when Brooke Lynn reached out, her hands trembling, Gio took a step back. His voice cracked, not with anger, but with the unbearable weight of truth as he said the words she feared most. "I don't want another mother." It wasn't an accusation. It was a shield. A way to protect the sanctity of Camila's memory, to defend the woman who had never let him feel abandoned even for a second. Those words didn't just wound Brooke Lynn, they unraveled her. She had carried the pain of letting him go for so long, had imagined him growing up in a good home, had prayed for his happiness even if it meant never seeing him again. And now, standing in front of the son she thought she lost forever, she had to confront the possibility that her return might only bring him more pain. But she didn't retreat. Even in the face of rejection, Brooke Lynn stood her ground. Not with anger or insistence, but with quiet resolve. She would not try to replace Camila. She would not force Gio to accept her. But she would be there, waiting, hoping, loving from a distance if she had to. Because for the first time in years, she had the chance to do something she had once been too afraid to do, fight for her child, not with arguments, but with unwavering presence. And Gio, though still tangled in grief, began to see the difference. Brooke Lynn did not demand love. She offered understanding. She did not compete with Camila's memory. She honored it. And in that, perhaps, there was room for healing, not now, not immediately, but eventually. Their story was no longer just about the past. It was about what they would do with the pieces now that the truth had shattered the illusion. It was about whether love could be rebuilt from pain, and whether two fractured souls could ever find their way back to each other, not as strangers, not even as mother and son, but as people willing to try. Camila had been everything to Gio. Not just a mother, but a safe harbor, a compass, a gentle, unwavering light in a world that had often felt too loud, too uncertain, too cruel. From his earliest memories, her presence was the one constant, the one source of security that made everything else bearable. She was the one who kissed his bruises when he fell, who stayed up through the night whenever he was sick, cooling his forehead with damp cloths and whispering lullabies until he drifted into fitful sleep. Every packed lunch, every birthday surprise, every quiet car ride filled with her soft humming had been a thread in the tapestry of love she wove around him. Her love had been steady, patient, and absolute, and Gio had believed in it completely, never once questioning whether it was real. Because it was real. Every moment, every embrace, every sacrifice, it had been real. But now, that truth, the truth that Camila was not his biological mother, came crashing down with devastating force. It didn't make her love less real, and yet, paradoxically, it made everything feel like a lie. That was the most unbearable part. Gio didn't know how to hold both truths in the same space, that someone could love you entirely, and yet not be who you thought they were. It was like having the foundation of his life cracked open beneath him, revealing a hidden chamber filled with secrets he was never meant to discover. And now that he knew, he couldn't unknow it. He couldn't look at the memories without seeing the shadow of deception curling around their edges. The revelation didn't just fracture his perception of Camila, it also stole something far deeper, his sense of identity. If she hadn't given birth to him, then who had? What blood ran through his veins? What stories, what legacies, what losses were his to inherit? The sudden emergence of Brooke Lynn, with her trembling voice and tear-filled eyes, only deepened the chaos in his soul. She came bearing truth like a blade, sharp, unavoidable, life-altering. And Gio, still mourning the woman who had raised him, was now expected to absorb the arrival of the woman who had birthed him. It felt like being asked to tear down his home and start again from rubble, with someone he had never met, someone who represented both the beginning and the end of everything he thought he knew. Joe's emotions fractured into impossible dualities. On one hand, there was an aching curiosity, an instinctual yearning to understand where he came from. Questions burned beneath the surface. Why was he given up? What was the story of his birth? What did it mean that his blood tied him to this woman now standing before him? But on the other hand, there was resistance, fierce and guttural. Because to allow room for Brooke Lynn meant having to reframe everything he'd built with Camila. It meant acknowledging that the woman who had nurtured him wasn't just a mother figure, she had, in some painful way, replaced someone else. And Gio didn't want her to be a replacement. He wanted her to be the whole story. Brooke Lynn, for her part, stood helplessly in the wake of his turmoil. She had waited so long for this moment, not out of arrogance or entitlement, but out of a desperate hope that maybe, somehow, she could still mean something to the son she'd never known. But now, looking into Joe's eyes, she saw the storm raging behind them, the grief, the confusion, the betrayal, and she realized she was not the answer to his pain. She was part of the cause. Her very presence reopened the wound of abandonment, a wound Gio hadn't even known he carried until it was ripped open by truth. She didn't blame him for the words he said, though each one felt like a fresh tear in the fabric of her heart. "I don't need another mother." His voice had been quiet but resolute, his eyes hardened with a pain he couldn't name. Brooke Lynn had dreamed of reunion, of connection, of some instant flicker of recognition between their souls. But what she found instead was a boy, now a man, still clinging to the mother who had loved him into existence, and who now had to grieve her all over again, not because she died, but because of what she hid. And Brooke Lynn understood. Love could not be demanded, only offered. Forgiveness could not be rushed, only waited for. So she didn't plead. She didn't justify. She simply stood there, letting him see her pain as honestly as he showed his. She knew it wasn't her place to try to erase Camila. She didn't want to. Camila had done something she herself could not, she had been there. She had mothered him when Brooke Lynn had walked away, terrified, pressured, and broken. But despite everything, Brooke Lynn hoped. She hoped that one day, Gio might look past the circumstances of his birth and see the love in her eyes, not as a threat to what he had with Camila, but as an extension of it. A different kind of love, not born of years shared, but of longing, regret, and the slow, painstaking rebuilding of trust. Gio, however, was not there yet. He oscillated between rage and sorrow, confusion and denial. His nights were sleepless, filled with dreams of Camila calling out to him, only to vanish the moment he reached her. He found himself retracing childhood haunts, trying to reassure himself that the memories were still real, that the moments hadn't disappeared just because the story behind them had changed. But in quiet corners of his mind, Brooke Lynn's face began to appear too, soft, haunted, waiting. He didn't know what to do with her. He didn't know if he wanted to. But part of him, the part that had always longed to know more about himself, couldn't quite push her away completely. He hated that he was beginning to see her not just as the woman who left, but as the woman who was also left behind. Left behind by time. By fear. By choices made in a world that hadn't been kind to either of them. In time, Gio would have to decide what to do with all the broken pieces, of truth, of love, of loss. Whether to let them remain scattered, or to slowly, carefully begin to piece them together into something new. Not a replacement for the past. But something that honored all of it, the mother who raised him, and the mother who bore him. The pain, the longing, the love. All of it real. All of it his. Lois had always believed she was doing what any loving mother would do. Protecting her daughter from a decision that might derail her life, shielding her from the shame and chaos of being a young, unwed mother in a world that often judged without mercy. She remembered the sleepless nights spent pacing the floor, the hushed conversations with Brooke Lynn in the kitchen when the rest of the house slept, the trembling in her daughter's voice as she confessed that she wasn't ready to be a mother. And so Lois, thinking she was offering the most compassionate advice, had gently, but firmly, encouraged her to give the child up. Not to a stranger, but to someone she trusted. To Camila. In Camila, Lois saw a woman of warmth and quiet strength, someone who had longed to be a mother and would cherish the opportunity as a divine gift. She had no doubt that Camila would raise the child with love and grace. And in her mind, she had stitched together a fairy tale where the child would thrive, and Brooke Lynn could eventually move forward, free from regret. But now, with the truth laid bare, that illusion had disintegrated into a nightmare of betrayal and guilt. Lois could no longer pretend her actions were noble. She had made a choice for everyone else, Brooke Lynn, Camila, and most tragically, for Gio, without considering the long-term emotional consequences. And now those consequences stood before her, furious and broken. Gio didn't just blame Brooke Lynn. His anger reached further, seeping into the corners of his heart where Lois once resided as a distant but familiar presence. To him, she had been the orchestrator of the lie. The keeper of the secret. The adult who had stood by and allowed his life to be built on a falsehood. He looked at her now with cold, betrayed eyes, eyes that refused to see her as a grandmother, let alone someone worthy of trust. Even Gloria, the grandmother who had once seemed like a loving figure, found herself the object of Joe's bitterness. He felt surrounded by betrayal, trapped in a web of deceit spun by the very people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. Every smile, every comforting word from his past now seemed laced with hidden agendas. Was anyone ever honest with him? Was there any moment that had been entirely real? This cloud of suspicion consumed him, pushing him deeper into himself. Where once he had been warm and open, Gio now became cold and withdrawn. He stopped answering calls. He shut down in conversations. His laughter, once effortless, disappeared entirely. Dante, too, found himself drowning in a sea of conflicting emotions. He had once looked at Gio with affection, never imagining that the boy who had drifted into their family circle through fate would one day be revealed as his own flesh and blood. The truth rocked him to his core. For years, he had grappled with the possibility that he might have a child out there, but the confirmation felt like being punched in the gut. Not only had he missed every milestone of Joe's life, he had also missed the chance to protect him from the pain that was now unraveling everything. Desperate to make amends, Dante tried to reach out, hoping to offer some sense of stability in the midst of the chaos. But Gio rejected him outright. In Joe's eyes, Dante was nothing more than a name in the lineup of those who had failed him. Another adult with blood ties and good intentions, arriving far too late to be relevant. How could he be a father to someone who had already grown up, who had already learned to survive without him? Worse yet, Gio saw Dante as part of the system that led to his separation from Brooke Lynn in the first place. Whether Dante had known or not didn't matter. His mere presence now was a painful reminder of everything Gio had lost. And so, when the storm became too loud, Gio turned inward, seeking comfort in the past. He found himself returning to Camila's old belongings. Boxes filled with handwritten letters, journals filled with tender musings about motherhood, pages that still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume. Camila had poured her heart into those writings. In them, Gio found traces of the woman who had shaped his life, loved him fiercely, and worried constantly about the day when the truth might surface. There were pages smudged with tear stains, entries about sleepless nights and quiet fears, and heartbreaking admissions that one day, she might lose him, not physically, but emotionally. One journal entry, in particular, gripped Joe's heart. Camila had written, "If he ever finds out, I hope he remembers how I held him when he cried. I hope he knows I was never trying to replace anyone, I was just trying to love the little boy who needed me." Gio clutched that page to his chest and cried, not just for Camila, but for himself. For the boy who didn't get to choose his story. For the young man now forced to live in its consequences. Meanwhile, Brooke Lynn remained steadfast, though heartbreakingly aware that her presence alone was a source of pain for her son. She didn't expect miracles. She knew she couldn't undo what had been done. But she also knew that love, when offered sincerely, had the power to heal, even the deepest wounds. So she chose not to push, not to demand. She left quiet messages for Gio where he might find them. Short letters filled with nothing more than a few lines of honesty. She would leave a book he used to love outside his door. She would show up at a music recital, sitting in the last row, never announcing herself, just observing from afar with quiet pride. And every time it rained, she left her front porch light on and her door unlocked, just in case. She never stopped believing. Not because she expected gratitude or absolution, but because she finally understood what it meant to be a mother, to love without conditions, to remain present even when you're unwelcome, to wait in silence if that's all you can offer. She didn't seek to replace Camila. She knew she couldn't. But she hoped that maybe, in time, she could be something else. Not a substitute, but a bridge, between pain and peace. And then, on a gray, drizzly evening that seemed like any other, she heard a knock. Her breath caught in her throat as she opened the door to find Gio standing there, rain-soaked and solemn. In one hand, he held a worn photograph of Camila, and in the other, a folded piece of paper. He said nothing, simply handed her the note. Brooke Lynn opened it slowly, her hands trembling. "I'm not ready to forgive," it read, "but I'm ready to listen." It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a resolution. But it was something. A beginning. A flicker of light in the ruins of everything they had lost. And in that moment, both of them realized that healing wouldn't come all at once, but it could come. Through small steps. Through raw honesty. Through patience, and presence, and a willingness to rebuild. Together, perhaps they could learn what it meant to be mother and son, not by erasing the past, but by honoring it as the complicated, painful, beautiful path that brought them to each other at last.